My name is Gerald Campano, and I'm currently a professor and chair of the Literacy, Culture, and International Education program at the Graduate School of Education. We know your time is precious and we're deeply grateful you're here. Please see our agenda today right on the slide. Penn, the seventh wealthiest university in the country and the most impoverished large city in the United States, does not pay property taxes to support the Philadelphia schools, even though it is the largest private land property owner in the city and has benefited from the city's public services, histories of gentrification in West Philadelphia, and giving its faculty, staff, and students access to all the attractions of this great city. The campaign for Penn and other wealthy nonprofits to make payments in lieu of taxes, pilots, to the school district has been going on for decades and is currently spearheaded by Jobs with Justice. Over the past year, faculty and staff at Penn finally joined community and students in organizing. And thanks to these collective efforts, including by many of you joining us here today, we have had a first victory. In November, Penn announced that it would pledge $100 million to the School District of Philadelphia over a 10-year period, an important public recognition of Penn's responsibility to the district. However, this time-limited quote-unquote gift falls short in two ways. First, it is not a permanent commitment. Second, Penn's payments of $10 million a year fall short of the standard our community has set. The citywide campaign led by Jobs with Justice has called for large nonprofits to pay 40% of what they would owe in property taxes. For Penn, that would mean paying an estimated $40 million a year, 4 times what it has pledged. Because Penn has promised to make 10 annual payments, it has created an opportunity for us to organize annually, each year pressing Penn to increase its payments until they finally meet our community standard, and also pressing Penn to make its payments permanent. We foresee an annual campaign cycle in which we mobilize around the city's budget negotiations every March, with the goal of winning increasing commitments from Penn that can be written into the city's budget. We want to share with you today what we see as the key arguments and strategies for an ongoing campaign for more significant pilots. I know that the pilots campaign has helped to re-energize so many of us affiliated with the Graduate School of Education to organize for racial and economic justice and reflect on and take action to address Penn's complicity in the unconscionable inequities in the school district of Philadelphia, which the pandemic has only exacerbated. We therefore want to work together with these colleagues and all of you to make sure that every year in which Penn's gift to Philadelphia becomes due, we demand that Penn make a bigger permanent commitment, that 40% of what it would owe in property taxes, to the children and schools of Philadelphia. Speaking first will be Akira Drake Rodriguez, faculty in City and Regional Planning in the Weitzman School of Design, on the conditions in the Philadelphia schools that make an ongoing commitment from Penn to a much more significant pilots payment so critical.
Thanks, Gerald. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues in Philadelphia schools, both the facilities and the actual resources that are within those facilities. As you all know, in 2019, the Philadelphia Inquirer published the Toxic Schools as part of the larger Toxic City series, detailing the scale and scope of asbestos, lead, vermin, and mold in all 215 school facilities operated by the district. In addition to the horrible conditions of these school facilities, which includes up to $4.5 billion of deferred maintenance over the last several decades, we have the general disinvestment that has come as we've witnessed several housing crises emerge that have reduced property taxes and revenues, a bunch of state austerity and federal austerity cuts in education spending that have essentially decimated the resources inside of the school facilities as well. So the loss of nurses, physicians, counselors, recreational services, the fact that many school buildings were constructed in the early 20th century and do not have cafeterias or spaces for recreation and safe play. These are all the things that a pilot could do. In addition, a pilot could do much more. In addition to that facilities maintenance that we have, we do need those resources in schools, and we need them urgently. urgently. So we need assistant teachers so we can lower teacher staff or teacher student ratios. Currently in Philadelphia high schools, the average classroom size is about 34 students, and the teachers are desperate to get that down to 25. That is something that Penn can fund directly, not through services in kind. Other things that are needed, again, are nurses, our physicians, our mental health counselors, guidance counselors in this year of the pandemic have been overwhelmed more than they've ever seen at much younger ages. And we need to build that pipeline desperately to ward off what could happen in the future. We also need to think about what opportunities have arose during the pandemic, thinking about the role of schools as critical infrastructure in our neighborhoods. What are we doing as a public citizen, as a large institution to support that infrastructure, not just for climate resilience, but general resilience from this pandemic? We've seen Chromebooks distributed, we've seen meals distributed, we've seen ongoing community services, using those spaces as new play spaces and really thinking about investing in schools that way. And so I think that if we are to push for the pilots, we can be quite specific in our demands of what exactly Penn should fund besides a general call to repair buildings and resources in general. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Akira. Now we'll have Tulia Folletti from Political Science speaking to how Penn can afford to commit to a more significant pilots payment.
Mute. Okay, sorry about my inadequacy in sharing my slides while trying to unmute at the same time. And now I'm in the conclusion. You've seen the conclusion quickly. All right, so Akira made wonderful points about the critical and urgent need for funding in the Philadelphia School District schools. So the question I want to tackle now is, can Penn afford these pilots now? And to do that, I've reviewed the annual financial reports that the university publishes publicly in its website that go from 1991 to the year 2020 included. And my short answer is that yes, definitely Penn can afford pilots. Let me remind you, although this may be already known to many of you, Penn Total's revenues is up of $11 billion at the moment. In property, plants and equipment, Penn has $8.8 billion. So its total assets are just above $30 billion by the end of December 2020, and its total liabilities about $10 billion. So how, with this budget, could Penn afford pilots? Well, it's a matter of priorities. When we launched the Penn for Pilots group, which, as Gerald mentioned, followed in the footsteps of many years of advocacy for Penn paying pilots done by students and faculty at Penn. But when we did this campaign in the summer, or this information session, we highlighted two mechanisms that the university could use to pay pilots. One was to change the spending rate of the endowment. Another one was debt allocation. What is very interesting in giving this talk now, some 8 months later, is that actually Penn has adopted these two mechanisms, but it has done it for other purposes. So let me walk you through what these two mechanisms entail, and also highlight the fact that surely there are other ways in which Penn could pay pilots. So the endowment, as many of you know, has grown exponentially over the last 3 decades, from a level of less than $1 billion in 1991 to over practically $15 billion by the end of 2020. Effective in year 2018, the university revised its spending rule formula such that the target expending rate of the endowment to be applied to the operating budget of the university would be around 5%. We noted back in the summer that if Penn increases the spending rate to 7%, which is the maximum allowed by Pennsylvania law, this would mean an extra $232 million in Penn's budget, way over the $40 million that Job for Justice is requesting in payments in lieu of taxes. What is very interesting is that to face the COVID pandemic, the Board of Trustees approved that higher spending rate. But unfortunately, we do not know how those extra monies have been allocated during the last year. Penn has very little faculty or staff involvement in its budget decision-making processes. So really, it's unknown to us, how that extra money has been allocated. It's also worth noting that despite the pandemic, the total assets of the university increased in the last fiscal year. And while its liabilities, as I will show in a moment, have also increased, the net assets have remained the same. So Penn is financially in as sound a position as it was before the pandemic. The second mechanism we had highlighted in the summer as a possibility for Penn to pay pilots was precisely increasing its level of debt to the level that it had in prior years. For example, studying the annual financial reports, we noted that in 2016, 62% of the endowment was spent or rather amounted to liabilities. And back then we calculated that if the university were to increase its debt from that then current level of 59% to 62% of the endowment, that would entail an extra $489 million for the university. Now, reviewing the last report, we learned that in fact, Penn did increase its liability much more than that, to $2.2 billion between 2019 and 2020. This represents the equivalent of 72% of the endowment, that is the current level of liabilities of the university, which is about 10 billion, almost 11 billion. So what we see also is that same that as with the spending rule, the amount of debt has increased in a context that where this is a logical step to take since interest rates are so low. But we don't know how this money is being allocated, precisely because we have almost no seat in the decision bodies where budget and allocation decisions are being made. So with this brief presentation, what I want to show is that this is not a matter of Penn having the money, but rather what the priorities are in spending that money. As the educational achievement gap increases in Philadelphia, particularly we see this between private and public schools, paying pilots to fund the Philadelphia School District school is not just the just thing to do, but also the right thing to do, particularly in the context of the pandemic. It's worth noting that it's also what all our peer institutions in the Ivy League are doing. So the question remains, why is Penn not doing this when our city so dearly needs it? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tulia. And now we will move on to Mary Summers from Political Science, who'll be speaking to Penn's arguments against pilots.
So much. I'm getting myself situated here and oh, and I had the same problem as Tulia. I'm at my last slide. Sorry. All right, here I am. So first, I just want to thank you all for being here today. And while Tulia spoke to the question of whether Penn can afford pilots, I'm going to speak to the other question we are asked the most. What are Penn's arguments against pilots? The truth is that in the context of the current city campaign, calling for pilots is an issue of economic and racial justice for all the children of Philadelphia. Penn has not issued any clear arguments defending its refusal to pay. We really have to go back to a different economic and political time when Penn did provide a substantial argument against pilots in the context of a desperate budget crisis, which had resulted in the decision to close 23 schools and lay off almost 20% of the district staff. Penn's response was to work with other higher eds to hire eConsult Solutions, Philadelphia-based think tank, to write a report with this quite dramatic title, The City of Philadelphia and Its Higher Ed's Shared Goals, Shared Missions, Shared Results, to be an explicit argument against pilots, which they released in October of 2013, when the district was in the midst of implementing these unbelievable cuts. Over the past year, David Cohen, the outgoing chair of the Board of Trustees, and some University of administrators have continued to allude to this report as if it made a thorough and definitive case against pilots. So it's worth knowing what's in it. And for those of you who are really interested, it's still available online. But basically, the report made two key arguments. First, that unlike cities like Boston and New Haven that depend almost entirely on property taxes, Philadelphia relies heavily on wage taxes. Therefore, Penn claims that while it makes sense for Harvard and Yale to contribute millions of dollars in pilots to their cities, Penn makes its contribution through its employees' wage taxes. Second, the report celebrated what it called the Philadelphia model of the city's relationship with its higher eds, as resulting in far more mutually beneficial contributions worth millions of dollars to schools and neighborhoods throughout the city. The key contrast, they claimed, was that if there were pilots, there would be conflict and transactional relationships between the city and its higher eds that would result in far fewer real benefits. Now for the realities that these arguments glossed over. First, Penn's employees pay wage taxes. Paying wage taxes is not the same as a wealthy institution like Penn making its own contribution to the city. Second, unlike the city, the Philadelphia School District's budget's primary local source of revenue is property taxes. Third, universities like Harvard and Yale and many tax-paying businesses choose both to pay pilots and promote other programs of community engagement, very like Penn's. Finally, as someone who has taught academically based community service courses at Penn for almost 20 years, I can tell you that most university efforts at community engagement are relatively one-sided initiatives based on university interests, priorities, and calendars. In coming up with its estimates of the value of these programs, eConsult Solutions used the standard nonprofit methodology of counting volunteers' time, all volunteers' time, as worth $25 an hour. That is surely a gross exaggeration of their actual worth, especially in schools where additional funding could have gone to keep nurses, counselors, art and music teachers, and full-time aides on staff. In my experience, service learning and volunteer programs can be meaningful and effective in schools where seasoned administrators and teachers have the time to participate in such partnerships. But in desperately understaffed schools with constant turnover, they all too often simply contribute to the chaos. The reality is that all Penn's programming in city schools would benefit enormously from a decision to pay pilots and an ongoing commitment to support the kind of quality education that the children of Philadelphia deserve. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mary. And finally, we're going to turn to Amy Offner from the History Department, who will speak to how pilots might figure in the overall funding of the Philadelphia schools, as well as next steps for the campaign.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. So let me see if I can get this set up so I can actually see my own screen. All right, so several colleagues have asked us how pilots would fit into the overall funding system for the Philadelphia public schools. And there seem to be two separate concerns. First, there's a question about whether pilots would make a difference. Would they be a significant source of revenue? And then on the other hand, some colleagues have wondered if the call for pilots asks too much of Penn, whether we are asking this one institution to shoulder a responsibility that really belongs to many in our society. So I want to start by looking at where public school funding comes from in Philadelphia. And the following slides are taken directly from the school district's own budget reports for fiscal year 2021. So what we see here is that about half of the school district's funds come from local revenues and half come from the state. Less than 1% comes from federal and other sources. Now this year we know that the public schools are slated to get a huge infusion of federal funds from the American Recovery Act. They're going to get about $1.3 billion that can be spent over the next 2 years to help the schools reopen safely. We don't yet have full details on how this money can and can't be spent. But it looks like certainly it's going to go to things like ventilation systems and PPE and other expenses like that. It would be completely transformative for the public schools to receive this kind of federal funding on an ongoing basis to meet, wide-ranging educational needs. And I think, many of us hope that the recovery package might be the basis for a bigger transformation of the U.S. welfare state. But right now, this is just a one-time infusion of federal funds targeted at the acute needs that the pandemic has created. And that means that the public schools are still facing a structural budget crisis in the long run. Now, if we look more closely at the local revenues that make up half of this budget, this is what we find. This is a breakdown of the sources of local revenue. And what we see here is that property taxes make up more than half of local revenues for the school district. That's the blue 51% on the left. You can see no other source of revenue even comes close. Our wage taxes are not even listed on here as a category of revenue. So that argument really needs to be put in perspective. What pilots would do is bring that property tax revenue closer in line to what it would be if the city's wealthiest private property owners paid what they actually owe in property taxes. The Philadelphia Inquirer found in 2019 that 17% of all property in the city, valued at $29.6 billion, was tax exempt. That arrangement reduced the city's annual property tax revenues by $414 million. Penn owned at least $2.5 billion worth of tax-exempt property, more than 8% of the citywide total. And of course, Penn is the largest private property owner in the city, period. So clearly, when wealthy institutions like Penn don't pay property taxes on billions of dollars of valuable urban property, it means that the schools go without, or that property taxes fall more heavily on people who are poorer and have less ability to pay. Now, when we see here that Penn owns 8 or 9% of the city's tax-exempt property, that can sound like a small amount. But Penn's share becomes more significant when we look at the breakdown of tax-exempt property in the city. This image, which is taken from that same Inquirer report, it shows the different kinds of institutions that own tax-exempt property. So we see, for instance, educational institutions on the top left in sort of aqua blue. We see medical institutions in orange in the middle, and so on. And what's striking is that a very large proportion of tax-exempt property is actually public property that could not conceivably be subject to taxation. So what I've done in this image is I've circled all of the public property in black and all of Penn's property in yellow. Public property actually represents 40% of all tax-exempt property. So if we remove public property from the picture, then Penn comes into focus as a rather more significant owner of tax-exempt property. It owns about 14% of all of the remaining tax-exempt property in the city. What also comes into focus is that we're not expecting Penn to shoulder this responsibility alone. The citywide campaign that we're part of is calling on all of the city's large universities and hospitals to meet the same standard, that is to pay 40% of what they would owe in property taxes to the public schools. Now, if we step back again and look at the school district's funding sources, pilots would allow the city to recoup a significant portion of its foregone local tax revenues. Pilots would represent one essential first step toward an adequate funding system, and they are, of course, part of a much larger picture. We know that the state of Pennsylvania has never implemented a fair funding system for the public schools, and as a result, Pennsylvania has one of the worst funding gaps between high-income and low-income school districts in the country. So winning a fair funding policy in Harrisburg has been a really long-term goal. It's completely essential. It's also a very hard fight to win given the composition of the state legislature. And what we know is that Penn and other institutions can voluntarily agree to pay pilots today and put tens of millions of dollars into the school district's budget right now. And if they do that, they might also then acquire a modicum of credibility to go to Harrisburg and support fair funding at the state level.